Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into the overlooked economic roots of the American Revolution. Everyone talks about liberty and redcoats, but have you ever stopped to ask, what if this rebellion wasn't just about freedom, it was about money, debt, and control? Let's set the stage. After the 7 Years' War, Britain was broke. I mean deeply, uncomfortably broke. The kind of broke where Parliament starts eyeing every spare coin in its empire, including those jingling in the pockets of American colonists. To pay down war debts, the British government did what governments often do. They reached for taxes. Not at home in England, of course. That would have sparked riots. Instead, they turned to the colonies. And here's where things get interesting. The colonies weren't just taxed, they were economically cornered. Laws like the Navigation Acts and the Molasses Act weren't new, but they were enforced with new intensity. These trade restrictions meant that colonists couldn't buy and sell freely. You want to ship goods to France or Spain? Nope. Want cheaper sugar from the Caribbean? Not unless it's British. And just like that, entrepreneurial freedom took a hit. Then came the Proclamation of 1763. This wasn't just a line on a map, it was a financial chokehold. Colonists were told, no more expanding west, no more land grabs. Why? Because land meant opportunity, land meant wealth, and Britain couldn't afford independent colonists growing too strong or too rich. But perhaps the most powerful fuel to this fire was resentment. The British Empire ran on mercantilism, a system where colonies existed to serve the mother country. Resources flowed in, profits flowed out. The colonists, naturally, began asking, why are we being taxed without a voice? Why are decisions about our economy being made across the ocean by people who've never even seen a tobacco field or a Boston dock? Economic discontent wasn't just simmering, it was reaching a boil. These weren't abstract grievances, they were kitchen table issues. Trade, land, representation, control. And once money gets involved, revolutions don't stay theoretical for long. Let's talk about the moment the British Crown decided to tax paper. It's 1765. The British Parliament rolls out something called the Stamp Act. Now at first glance, that doesn't sound too dramatic, right? But this law wasn't just about stamps like you'd find at the post office. It was a sweeping tax on almost every printed material in the colonies, contracts, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. And suddenly, every transaction, from a business deal to a legal filing to a funeral certificate, came with a new price tag. Pay the tax, or you're not officially recognized. It wasn't just annoying, it was paralyzing, especially for merchants, lawyers, and printers, the backbone of colonial commerce and communication. But here's the thing, the outrage wasn't just about the money, it was about consent. These taxes were passed in London by lawmakers the colonists had no role in choosing. Imagine being told what to pay and how to live by a distant power you had no say in electing. Sound familiar? That's where resistance took shape. Lawyers and merchants saw the threat immediately. They weren't radicals, they were business people. But they realized that the Stamp Act threatened not just profit, but principle. This was economic subjugation with legal teeth. So they fought back, with boycotts, petitions, and powerful public campaigns. The Sons of Liberty, that now famous group of agitators, emerged from this very crisis. Non-importation agreements spread across the colonies. Businesses refused to stock British goods. Communities pledged to support local production instead. And guess what? It worked. British merchants, feeling the squeeze from boycotts across the Atlantic, began pressuring Parliament. Because while governments may ignore principle, they rarely ignore profit. Within a year, the Stamp Act was repealed. That moment revealed something crucial. Colonial resistance didn't just take the form of speeches and protests. It weaponized economics. It showed that coordinated market pressure could bend the will of a global empire. The revolution, it turns out, was already being rehearsed in the marketplace. By now, colonial resistance was no longer a whisper, it was a drumbeat. And in 1773, that drumbeat turned into a cannon blast over tea. The British East India Company was in financial trouble, and the Crown needed a lifeline. So Parliament passed the Tea Act. On paper, it looked like a tax break, but not for colonists. It gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, undercutting local merchants and bypassing colonial trade channels entirely. In short, it wasn't about tea. It was about who got to control the rules of the game. And the colonists? They were done playing along. That December, a group of patriots boarded ships in Boston Harbor, dressed as Mohawk warriors, and dumped over 90,000 pounds of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just rebellious, it was economic sabotage, a full-on, symbolic assault on Britain's claim to commercial dominance. Now, how did the British government respond? With what they called the Coercive Acts. But in the colonies, they had another name, the Intolerable Acts. They weren't just laws, they were punishments. Boston Harbor was shut down, cutting off vital trade. Massachusetts' charter was revoked, removing self-governance, and British troops could now be quartered in private homes. These weren't just political moves, they were economic strangulations. Imagine your business closed, your town occupied, your autonomy revoked, all because you protested unfair pricing. And here's the twist: the coercive acts didn't scare people into submission. They radicalized the moderates. Even colonists who had once hoped for peace, for reconciliation, began to see the pattern. That this wasn't just about taxes or tea, it was about total control. The British response unified resistance across the colonies. Farmers, tradesmen, shopkeepers, they saw their future under threat and began choosing sides. The Crown's heavy hand, meant to crush rebellion, ended up forging a revolution. Let's talk about something often forgotten in history class. The colonies didn't just differ in accents or crops. They had entirely different economies. Each colony had its own currency, its own tax structures, and trade practices shaped by local needs. In many ways, this decentralization was a strength. It allowed communities to adapt to their environments, their markets, their people. It wasn't chaos, it was autonomy. But to the British Empire, that kind of flexibility looked a lot like disobedience. So came the imperial push for uniformity. Take the Currency Act of 1764. It banned the colonies from printing their own paper money. Now that might sound technical, but let's be real, money is power. When you control the currency, you control credit, you control debt, and you control value. By stripping colonies of the ability to issue their own money, Parliament effectively said, you don't get to fund your own growth anymore. All roads lead to London. Customs enforcement grew stricter too. Taxes weren't just collected, they were enforced with armed oversight. Officials began cracking down on smuggling, seizing goods, and punishing those who stepped out of line economically. This wasn't about collecting a fair share. It was about eliminating independent financial governance. Bit by bit, economic decisions once made in town halls were being overridden by bureaucrats an ocean away. And the colonists? They noticed. Losing the ability to manage your own currency, your own trade, your own taxes, that wasn't just inconvenient. It was existential. The very fabric of economic self-rule was being unraveled. What happens when a decentralized system is forced into a centralized mold? What happens when economic independence is no longer allowed? You get resistance, you get organizing, and eventually, you get revolution. We often think of the Declaration of Independence as a grand proclamation about freedom, rights, and human dignity, and it is. But buried within Jefferson's elegant language is something just as vital, an economic warning. Think about it. The document doesn't begin with emotional appeals, it starts with grievances, a long list. And many of those complaints, they're not just about justice, they're about trade, taxation, and financial control. Jefferson accused the king of cutting off colonial trade with other parts of the world, of imposing taxes without consent, of manipulating judges and obstructing laws that supported local governance. These weren't abstract ideals, they were threats to livelihoods, to farmers, traders, and artisans just trying to survive and prosper. Let's pause there. When Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that last part, pursuit of happiness, was revolutionary. It wasn't just about feelings. It implied the right to seek prosperity, to own property, to build a life through labor and voluntary exchange, free from coercive interference. That's a fundamentally economic idea. The Declaration called out the danger of centralized power, especially when that power interfered with markets, with contracts, and with the local ability to govern one's own financial affairs. In a way, it wasn't just breaking political ties, it was severing the economic leash. The message was clear: we'll trade with who we want. We'll use money we create. We'll build wealth on our own terms, not as subjects, but as free people. So yes, the Declaration is a political document, but read between the lines, and you'll see it's also a declaration of economic sovereignty. So now the colonies had declared independence. The political chains were off, but that didn't mean smooth sailing economically, because once you break away from the empire's financial system, you have to build your own. Fast. Enter the Continental Congress and the Great Money Experiment. They began printing their own currency, the Continental Dollar. At first, this seemed like a solution. No need to tax citizens harshly right away. Just print what you need to fund the war. But here's the problem with printing money without backing it up. People begin to lose faith in its value. The phrase "are not worth a Continentals" didn't come from nowhere. It came from watching inflation spiral out of control. Soldiers were paid in paper that couldn't buy bread. Merchants refused to accept notes. Confidence collapsed. What was supposed to fund liberty began to feel like a con. And when they tried taxation, it was even messier. The Continental Congress had no power to enforce taxes. Everything depended on the states voluntarily contributing funds. Spoiler alert, They didn't. Each state had its own currency, its own priorities, its own internal politics. This was radical decentralization in action. No central bank, no national tax code, no standard currency. In some ways, it was pure financial autonomy. In others, pure chaos. And yet, embedded in that chaos was a lesson. The colonists weren't ready to hand over centralized taxing power, not even to their own Congress. They had just fought a war against coercive revenue collection. The memory of imperial taxation was still raw. Trust was fragile. So while the system cracked and strained under its own contradictions, it also revealed something powerful. The revolution wasn't just about rejecting Britain. It was about testing the limits of decentralized governance, economically, politically, and philosophically. And those tests, they would echo into the next great debate, the Constitution. By the end of the revolution, one thing was clear: Americans didn't just want freedom from Britain, they wanted freedom from taxation. Period. But here's the irony. You can't build a functioning nation without some form of revenue. And yet, every attempt to raise funds after the war ran headfirst into the very ideas that had fueled the revolution. Remember, these were people who had just risked their lives to escape arbitrary rule. They weren't exactly eager to sign up for a new tax collector, especially if he lived down the street instead of across the ocean. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing framework, reflected that fear. Congress couldn't levy taxes. It had to request money from the states, like a kid asking for allowance. And the states? They weren't always generous. This led to massive underfunding of the national government. War debts lingered. Soldiers went unpaid. Infrastructure projects stalled. And it all fed into a growing anxiety. If we don't centralize just a little, will the whole thing fall apart? Cue the Constitutional Convention. Some wanted a stronger federal government, especially when it came to taxation and monetary policy. Others feared that any new power would become just like the old empire. The debates were fierce. The scars of economic coercion hadn't healed. This wasn't just political theory, it was personal. Farmers, merchants, tradesmen, they remembered how easy it had been for power to twist financial tools into weapons of control. That revolutionary distrust of taxes didn't die with the war. It mutated. It became part of the national DNA, fueling everything from local rebellions like Shays' Rebellion to the careful limits placed on federal authority in the Constitution. And even after a new system was created, the tension remained. How do you fund a government without betraying the very ideals that created it? It's a question America would wrestle with again and again, in every crisis, in every reform, and maybe, or still does. So what do we take from all this? The American Revolution wasn't just about muskets and monarchs. It was about something deeper, something economic. It was a rebellion against imposed systems, systems that controlled currency, dictated trade, taxed without consent, and centralized power far from the people who felt its weight. The colonists weren't just fighting for independence, they were fighting for the right to manage their own affairs, to pursue prosperity on their own terms, to experiment, to fail, to thrive, not because some distant authority permitted it, but because freedom demanded it. And while the revolution didn't create a perfect system, it created a tension, a dynamic tension between liberty and order, between decentralization and national unity. That tension is still alive today. Every time we debate taxation, inflation, national debt, or central planning, we're echoing conversations that began in taverns and town halls nearly 250 years ago. Because at the heart of the American experiment is a radical idea. That economic freedom is more than a policy preference. It's a moral question. It's about dignity, consent, control over your own labor, your own land, your own future. So the next time someone says the revolution was just about taxes, you'll know better. It was about systems, incentives, autonomy, and the invisible threads between money and power. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through hidden history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And check out my book History They Tried to Erase, linked in the description below. It dives even deeper into the stories that got buried, and why they still matter. For more content that challenges the mainstream and reveals what's been hiding beneath the surface, keep exploring right here on Truth Behind History.